821, welcome back. We're here with Norm Pattis and Chris DeSanctis. We're talking more about the death penalty. Before the break, Chris, you were making the point that the death penalty isn't what costs a lot, the actual act of it. It's the endless appeals and the lawyers and everything, and that's why there needs to actually be reform with the appeals process. And Norm, I know you wanted to talk a little bit about that aspect.
Yeah, it's incorrect, as a matter of fact, to say that there are special rules applicable to capital cases on appeal. There may well be need to reform post-conviction relief in Connecticut. The habeas corpus process in Connecticut permits an inmate to bring a challenge to his appeal, to his conviction, rather, at any time he's in custody. Thus, if you're there for life, that's forever. Maybe there ought to be a time limit on it. It's not uncommon.
Why does it take so long? And in the last 50 years, the only person to be executed has been Michael Ross in 2005, and it just seems like these people sit on death row until they basically
Michael Ross would not have been executed had he not opted for death.
To make the point
I've represented a man who's on death row. He's been there since the early 1990s. He'll probably outlive me. But it's not because of the post-conviction process. I think the state lacks the political will ultimately to kill more often than it does. I think if the state wanted to kill, it could. But it's to say that the post-conviction relief process is what drives the cost is only partially true. If you look at the Komarsiewski case, it cost $500,000 in legal fees prior to the beginning of evidence. A large part of that was marshaling the mitigation phase, the penalty phase evidence. To adequately defend a man in death penalty, you're required to review basically every piece of paper you can find, all of his records throughout his entire life. That is an enormously costly process. I don't think people say we want to trim the defense on the merits at trial. I hear Mr. DeSantis, Professor DeSantis, saying he wants to trim post-conviction relief, perhaps, but to suggest that it's different for death is wrong. There's unlimited appeals in Connecticut on collateral attacks.
I've heard arguments that suggest that the death penalty is too easy for these criminals, these murderers, and that life behind bars with no possibility of parole is actually a worse punishment.
I would just go back to my first point to say that people who are convicted of capital offenses or on trial for capital offenses, they never opt for life in prison. Excuse me, they never opt for the death penalty. They always plea bargain for life in prison because it's natural. It's human nature. People fear death more than they fear life. So capital offenders who have killed someone also don't want their life to be taken. And that's why they plea bargain for life in prison. And I think that's just a human nature. People want to live, and so do capital offenders. And this is why I believe that there is a deterrent effect. It just built into us. Forget the studies for a second. I think it's just natural that people want to live.
Sure. Norm, there have been victims, or there have been the families and loved ones of victims who have been killed, and they want to see that killer put to death. They think it's going to give themselves some closure. They feel it's the right thing to do. It's the just thing to do. That person killed my mother, my daughter, my son, my whatever, and therefore that person should die, and that will help me get over it and get on with my life. What about that argument?
I think that's self-indulgent nonsense. I mean, the fact of the matter is a person whose loved one has been destroyed by an act of violence isn't going to be repaired by killing another person. Gandhi once said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. As a matter of common law, we say that no person can be a judge in our own case, but yet then we yield the courthouse to victims in these cases and say, whatever you like, dear. At what point do we get put out of the misery of those who've been destroyed by idiosyncratic acts of violence by others? We can be sympathetic all we want, but to let the victims control the shot and to say to make them feel better, to give them closure, we're going to permit the state to kill others. I think the loneliest person in the state the day after a man is executed is a victim's family. They don't have closure, then they've got nothing.
Can I respond to that? There is a YouTube video titled Gone Too Soon, and the video highlights Michaela Pattis, the 11-year-old girl who was murdered by Komarsiewski. Her life indeed was taken too soon from us, and it was taken heinously. And I believe that Komarsiewski should receive the death penalty for that. Now, it is not because I have this need for raw revenge or my emotions are flying high. It's my sense of justice. And I believe a lot of people out there have a sense of justice, that this is justice and he should be given the death penalty. There's nothing wrong with emotions, but, you pass the state Supreme Court building here in Hartford, and it says justice up there. And it's a sense of justice.
Letting the state kill doesn't justice in my mind. It's savagery.
And we're going to have to leave it at that. Norm Pattis, Chris DeSanctis, good to see the two of you. Appreciate